I didn't say a word when the fake security guard stepped out of his unmarked van and started yelling about citizens' arrests. I just reached into my jacket, pulled out my state police credentials, and watched his face go from smug authority to absolute terror in about 3 seconds. Behind him, the HOA president, who'd been filming the whole thing for what she thought would be her triumphant social media moment, slowly lowered her phone. The contractor was still fumbling with his plastic badge when I informed him that impersonating law enforcement was a felony, and that his private security license would be suspended, pending investigation. 23 years on the force teaches you to stay calm when amateurs try to play cop. It also teaches you exactly which laws they're breaking while they do it. Before all this started, I had exactly the retirement I'd planned for. After 2 decades of dealing with actual criminals, domestic violence calls, and highway fatalities, I wanted nothing more than to disappear into the woods with my dog and a fishing pole. The house I bought was perfect for that, a modest ranch, on 3 acres, at the end of a dead-end road, surrounded by old-growth pines that had been standing since before the subdivision was even a thought. The previous owner had been an elderly veteran who'd maintained the place meticulously, but never bothered with landscaping or curb appeal. That suited me fine. I didn't want manicured lawns or decorator mailboxes. I wanted privacy, quiet, and the freedom to sit on my back deck at 6 in the morning with coffee and watch deer graze in my yard. Without some neighbor trying to make conversation over the fence, the first 6 months were everything I'd hoped for. I'd wake up when my body felt like it, not when a radio dispatcher was screaming about a 3-car Piapo. I rebuilt the deck, refinished the hardwood floors, and spent entire afternoons reading crime novels in my recliner without my phone ringing every 20 minutes. My nearest neighbor was a quarter-mile away, and we had the perfect relationship. We waved when we saw each other and minded our own business the rest of the time. The only mail I got was utility bills and pension statements. No HOA newsletters, no community meeting announcements, no violation notices. I thought I'd finally found a place where being left alone was still an option. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in October. I was having coffee on the deck when a white sedan pulled into my driveway. A woman in her 50s got out, wearing a business suit that looked expensive, and carrying a clipboard like it was a weapon. She introduced herself as Margaret Hoffman, president of the Pine Ridge Homeowners Association, and informed me that there had been some confusion about my property's inclusion in their jurisdiction. According to her, a recent boundary survey had revealed that my land fell within their association's authority, and I would need to bring my property into compliance with their covenants and restrictions immediately. She handed me a packet of documents thicker than most police reports I'd filed, along with a preliminary violation notice citing my unkempt landscaping, non-conforming exterior paint, and unauthorized modifications to the existing structure. I looked at this woman standing on my deck, pointing out violations on property I owned outright, and felt the same kind of disbelief I used to get when people would call 911 to report their neighbor's music being too loud at 2 in the afternoon. I told her politely that I'd never signed any HOA agreement, that my property deed made no mention of any homeowners association, and that I'd purchased the house specifically because it wasn't part of any community with restrictions. She smiled the kind of smile I'd seen on plenty of suspects who thought they were smarter than they actually were, and explained that HOA membership wasn't optional, it was tied to the land itself, and previous owners' failures to disclose didn't invalidate my obligations. She gave me 30 days to complete the required improvements or face daily fines of $200. After she left, I did what any reasonable person would do. I called the title company that had handled my closing and asked them to explain how I'd somehow missed signing up for an HOA that wanted to control the color of my shutters. The title officer sounded genuinely confused and promised to research the issue. 3 days later, she called back with an apology. There had been no HOA disclosures in my file because their records showed no homeowners association with authority over my property. She suggested I request documentation from the HOA proving their jurisdiction and contact a real estate attorney if they continued to press the issue. So I sent Margaret Hoffman a polite email asking for copies of the survey she'd mentioned, the original HOA covenants that supposedly bound my property, and any legal documentation establishing their authority over my land. I explained that my title company had no record of HOA obligations, and that I was simply trying to understand the situation. I attached copies of my deed and the title insurance policy, thinking that would clear things up quickly. Professional, reasonable, and backed up with facts. Exactly the approach that had served me well in 23 years of police work. The response I got 2 weeks later wasn't from Margaret Hoffman. It was from something called Pine Ridge HOA Enforcement Services. And it wasn't an email, it was a certified letter demanding immediate payment of $800 in accumulated fines for continued non-compliance and failure to respond to official HOA communications. The letter informed me that my account had been turned over to their enforcement division, and that further violations would result in escalated enforcement actions, including but not limited to lien filing, asset seizure, and criminal trespass charges. That phrase, criminal trespass charges, was where they made their first real mistake. You can't commit criminal trespass on your own property, and anyone with even basic legal knowledge would know that. But more importantly, the letter was signed by someone calling himself Chief Enforcement Officer Daniel Morrison, and it was printed on letterhead designed to look official, complete with a badge logo and Law Enforcement Division in bold letters across the top. In my professional experience, only 2 types of people try that hard to look like law enforcement: actual law enforcement, and people who definitely aren't law enforcement but want you to think they are. I started making phone calls. The county assessor confirmed that my property had never been part of any homeowners association and that no HOA had ever filed liens or enforcement actions against my address. The state corporation database showed that Pine Ridge Homeowners Association was a legitimate entity, but their registered agent was a strip mall law office that specialized in debt collection, not a community management company. Most interesting of all, when I ran Daniel Morrison's name through the state licensing database, I found that he held a basic private security license, the kind you get for working mall security or apartment complex patrol, not the kind that gives you any authority to issue fines or threaten criminal charges. But here's what really caught my attention. The address listed for Pine Ridge HOA Enforcement Services was a post office box, but the phone number on their letterhead belonged to a security company called Morrison Protection Services. When I looked up Morrison Protection Services, I found a website advertising HOA compliance enforcement, violation documentation, and resident intimidation prevention. The site featured photos of Daniel Morrison in what appeared to be a police uniform, complete with badge and gun belt, standing next to official-looking vehicles with light bars and emergency equipment. Now, I was curious in the way that only a career cop can be curious. I started driving around the Pine Ridge subdivision, which was about 2 miles from my house, looking for any signs of this enforcement operation. What I found was a community of about 50 homes, most of them well-maintained, with a small clubhouse and a management office in a converted double-wide trailer. I parked across the street and watched for a couple of hours, and sure enough, around 3 in the afternoon, a white van with Pine Ridge Security painted on the side pulled up to the management office. The driver got out wearing black tactical pants, a black polo shirt with patches and badges sewn all over it, and a duty belt that looked like it came from a police surplus store. I followed the van when it left, staying well back and using all the surveillance techniques I'd learned in 23 years of actual police work. Daniel Morrison, because that's who it was, spent the next 2 hours driving through various neighborhoods, stopping at houses where he would take photos, measure fence heights, and document what appeared to be violations of community standards. At each stop, he would put on a black baseball cap with enforcement embroidered in white letters, and adjust his duty belt so the handcuffs and radio were clearly visible. He was playing dress-up as a cop and using that costume to intimidate homeowners into compliance with rules they may or may not have actually agreed to follow. The next morning, I called the state licensing board for private security companies and spoke with an investigator named Janet Pierce. I explained that I was a retired state police officer with concerns about a private security contractor who appeared to be impersonating law enforcement in the course of HOA enforcement activities. Janet was immediately interested apparently. They'd been getting complaints about aggressive HOA enforcement companies for months, but most homeowners were too intimidated to file formal complaints. She asked me to document everything I'd observed and forward copies of all communications I'd received from Morrison and the HOA. While I was building my case against Morrison, the HOA decided to escalate their own efforts. I started getting daily letters about new violations. My mailbox was the wrong color. My driveway had oil stains. My garbage cans were visible from the street on non-pickup days. Each letter came with additional fines and increasingly threatening language about legal action. But the letters were still coming from the strip mall law office, not from any court or legitimate government agency. So I filed them away and continued my investigation. Then, on a Thursday morning in November, Daniel Morrison made the mistake that would end his career. I was in my garage working on an old motorcycle when I heard a vehicle pull into my driveway. I looked out to see the white enforcement van, and Morrison getting out wearing his full costume tactical pants, duty belts, radio, handcuffs, and what appeared to be a badge hanging from his shirt pocket. He was carrying a clipboard and what looked like a camera, and he was heading straight for my front door. I watched through the window as he knocked, waited about 30 seconds, then started walking around my house, taking photos and making notes. He measured the height of my fence, documented the fact that my lawn hadn't been mowed in 2 weeks, and took close-up photos of paint chips on my front steps. Then he went to his van, pulled out an orange notice, and stapled it to my front door. The notice declared my property to be in severe violation of community standards and stated that I had 24 hours to contact HOA enforcement or face immediate legal action, including but not limited to criminal prosecution for defiance of lawful authority. That phrase, lawful authority, was his second major mistake. Private security guards don't have lawful authority over anyone except in very specific circumstances involving the property they're contracted to protect. But Morrison had just claimed lawful authority over my property, which he had no right to be on in the first place, while wearing a costume designed to make him look like a police officer. In legal terms, that's false impersonation of a law enforcement officer, criminal trespass, and harassment, all misdemeanor charges that could cost him his license and possibly land him in jail. I called Janet Pierce at the state licensing board and told her that Morrison had just escalated to actively impersonating law enforcement on private property. She said they were ready to move forward with their investigation, but asked if I could arrange for Morrison to repeat his performance in front of witnesses, or, ideally, video cameras. That gave me an idea that would have been completely inappropriate when I was an active police officer, but was perfectly legal now that I was just a private citizen with a legitimate complaint. I sent an email to Margaret Hoffman at the copying Daniel Morrison, in which I politely informed them that I would be home the following Tuesday afternoon to discuss their jurisdiction claims in person. I mentioned that I had some questions about the legal basis for their enforcement actions, and suggested that their enforcement officer might want to be present to explain the authority under which he'd been operating on my property. I made sure to sound cooperative and slightly confused, like someone who was finally ready to give in to their demands, but needed some clarification first. Tuesday afternoon came, and right on schedule, the white van pulled into my driveway. This time, Morrison wasn't alone. Margaret Hoffman was with him, along with another woman I didn't recognize, who was carrying a tablet and appeared to be recording everything. Morrison was wearing his full costume again, including what I now realized was a fake police badge pinned to his shirt. They approached my front door like they owned the place, with Morrison taking the lead and the women following behind him like backup officers. I opened the door before they could knock, smiled politely, and asked what I could do for them. Morrison immediately launched into an aggressive speech about my property being in violation of multiple HOA covenants, my failure to respond to official enforcement notices, and my obligations as a community member to maintain appropriate standards. He was standing with his hand resting on his fake duty belt, speaking in the authoritative tone that cops use when they're trying to establish control of a situation. The woman with the tablet was filming everything, apparently expecting me to break down and apologize, or maybe get angry and give them footage they could use against me. Instead, I listened patiently until Morrison finished his speech, then asked him a simple question. "Are you a police officer?" He straightened up, adjusted his fake badge, and replied that he was Chief Enforcement Officer for Pine Ridge HOA Security Division, authorized to conduct investigations and issue citations for violations of community standards. I nodded and asked him to clarify what law enforcement agency had appointed him to that position. He looked confused and started talking about his contract with the Homeowners Association and his state security license. That's when I reached into my jacket and pulled out my own credentials, the real ones, issued by the state police, with my photo and badge number and 23 years of actual law enforcement experience behind them. I introduced myself by name and rank, explained that I was a retired state police officer, and informed Morrison that he was currently on my private property without permission, wearing clothing and badges designed to impersonate law enforcement, and making false claims about his legal authority. The change in Morrison's demeanor was immediate and complete. The authoritative cop voice disappeared, replaced by stammering explanations about contracts and security licenses and homeowners association bylaws. Margaret Hoffman started backing toward the van, suddenly very interested in something on her phone. The woman with the tablet stopped recording and tucked the device into her purse like it had caught fire. I kept talking in the calm, professional tone I'd used for thousands of traffic stops and domestic dispute calls. I explained that Morrison's behavior constituted criminal impersonation of a law enforcement officer, that his presence on my property without permission was criminal trespass, and that his threats about criminal prosecution were harassment. I mentioned that the state licensing board was already investigating his company based on complaints I'd filed, and that this encounter would be included in my supplemental report. I also noted that the woman filming had just documented Morrison's impersonation of law enforcement, which would make excellent evidence in any criminal or civil proceedings. Morrison was sweating now, pulling off his fake badge and trying to explain that he'd never claimed to be a real police officer, that his uniform was just professional security attire, and that there must have been some misunderstanding about his authority. Margaret Hoffman was in full retreat, calling to Morrison that they needed to leave immediately to check on some other properties. The woman with the tablet was already at the van, but I wasn't finished. I informed Morrison that I would be filing a formal complaint with the state licensing board regarding his impersonation of law enforcement, and that I would be recommending criminal charges for trespass and harassment. I also mentioned that his company's practices appeared to violate several state laws regarding debt collection and consumer protection, and that I would be forwarding my findings to the Attorney General's office for review as they scrambled into the van and drove away. I pulled out my phone and called Janet Pierce. She was delighted to hear that Morrison had repeated his performance, and even more interested when I told her about the video evidence his accomplice had accidentally created. She said the licensing board would be scheduling a hearing within 30 days, and that Morrison's security license would be suspended pending the outcome of their investigation. 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from the Strip Mall Law Office informing me that Pine Ridge HOA had reviewed my case and determined that there had been an error in their boundary determination. My property was, in fact, not subject to HOA jurisdiction, and all fines and violations were being withdrawn. The letter included a formal apology for any inconvenience and assured me that I would not be contacted by HOA enforcement in the future. The following month, Janet Pierce called to let me know that Daniel Morrison's private security license had been permanently revoked following their investigation. Morrison Protection Services had been dissolved, and Morrison himself was facing misdemeanor charges for impersonation of law enforcement and harassment. Several other homeowners had come forward with complaints about his tactics, and the Attorney General's office was reviewing the business practices of multiple HOA enforcement companies across the state. But the most satisfying part came 3 months later, when I was having coffee at a diner in town and overheard 2 women at the next table talking about their HOA problems. One of them mentioned that their enforcement officer had been arrested for impersonating a police officer, and that the whole company had been shut down. She said the HOA was scrambling to find a new management company, and that several board members had resigned rather than deal with the legal mess. The other woman asked what had happened, and the first one replied, "Apparently they tried to intimidate some retired cop, and he knew exactly which laws they were breaking." I finished my coffee, left a good tip, and walked out to my truck feeling better than I had in months. Sometimes the system actually works the way it's supposed to. You just have to know which buttons to push and how hard to push them. 23 years of police work had taught me both, and retirement had given me the time and patience to do it right. These days, my morning coffee on the deck is exactly as quiet as I'd planned it to be. The deer still graze in my yard, my neighbors still wave when they see me, and my mailbox contains nothing but utility bills and pension statements. No violation notices, no enforcement threats, no fake cops in costume trying to tell me how to maintain my own property. Just the kind of peace and quiet that every honest person deserves, and that some people have to fight to keep.